are the lateral view of the brain model, and we're going to start with the cerebrum and then move through the different lobes.
Okay, this is the cerebrum. This whole part here is the cerebrum, and it is characterized by the presence of these gyri, these convexities that make these little patterns on the brain, and those are delineated by these indentions called sulci. So the gyri are the parts that stick out, the sulci are the ones that fold in, and this creates more surface area over the brain. So we can look at this, all of this is the cerebrum. This is the seat of higher intelligence, really, and we can divide it into several lobes, each of which with specific functions. Before we look at each of the individual lobes, it's helpful to define some landmarks. So one of the major landmarks we're going to see separates left and right hemispheres. So that would be the longitudinal fissure. And if you stick your fingers in there, yes, indeed, it is a fissure. And it separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. And then we have the transverse cerebral fissure, which is going to separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Then we can start to look at individual lobes. Before we do that, one more major landmark. We have the central sulcus, and that is this large sulcus that pretty much divides the brain into front and posterior, I should say anterior and posterior parts. We also have the lateral sulcus right here, which is going to delineate this part here, which is going to be our temporal lobe, not surprisingly that it is right under the temporal bone. Then we are going to have our frontal lobe. It's going to be anterior to the central sulcus. Not surprisingly, it's under the frontal bone. Then if we look posterior to the central sulcus, we will see the parietal lobes on either side. And this is mostly colored in purple here. So this purple lavendery stuff is the parietal lobes. Those will kind of bleed over into the occipital lobe, which is behind, or I should say, deep to the occipital bone. And basically it's kind of a very nondescript border as you move from the parietal lobe to the occipital lobe, but we're basically counting all of this as the occipital lobe. And then we have one other sulcus that we can define, the parieto-occipital sulcus, which on the exterior part of the brain is really quite difficult to discern. And really, it's basically just a connect the dots kind of thing from one sulcus to another that sort of traces the outside of the